Right, good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to yet another webinar brought to you by SIOS. I think this is the 11th or the 12th webinar that SIOS is bringing to the members and the safety fraternity at large since the start of lockdown. My name is Niels Norkier. I am the CEO of SIOS. SIOS is the South African Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, a SACWA recognized professional body for occupational health and safety practitioners in South Africa. SIOS has 3 professional designations that is registered on the NQF by SACWA in terms of the NQF Act, namely technical member, graduate member, and chartered member. Currently, we're one of the largest health and safety professional bodies in the world with just over 16,000 members. Please note that this webinar is CPD verified by SIOS with 2 CPD points. SIOS members can claim the CPD points directly after the webinar by logging into their profile and claiming the 2 CPD points for this webinar. If you're not sure how to do this or have not done it before, if you go to the SIOS website on the professional registration page drop down, you will see a link to CPD, and there's a video tutorial that can show you how to claim the 2 CPD points. Just some housekeeping announcements before we start this exciting webinar this morning. Please note that the Q&A section, the questions and answer section, is open. Please do not quote or post any questions on the Q&A which is not related to this morning's presentation. Which is obviously the draft regulations for biological hazardous agents. We will be able to field some of those questions, or the most important ones that we receive, directly after the presentation is completed. But as indicated, we will not field any non-related questions. The chat box is open, so please feel free to chat, to meet and greet, and send your messages and your well wishes, whatever you want to put in the chat box. But reserve the Q&A for questions and only related to this presentation. We are fortunate enough that we also have on the panel this morning Garth Hunter, a chartered member of SIOS, a registered occupational hygienist, which will facilitate the Q&A after the presentation this morning and post the questions to the presenter. If there's any technical issues that you have with regarding sound, we have checked all the sound and the video. It's broadcasting perfectly. But if you have any issues with technical issues like video or sound, please post that in the chat box. And at the back end, we have Gareth, our communications and membership manager, that will assist you and tell you where to click and how to sort that out. If you missed this webinar, will be recorded this morning. It will be within a day available on the SIOS platforms, i.e. our website. All members will also receive a direct link to the recording if you want to rebroadcast it or show it at work to fellow employees or even your management. And it will also be available on our Facebook page as well. If you have missed any of the previous webinars that was brought to you by SIOS, you're welcome to go and look it up on our social medias as well, which is our Facebook and our website page. Right, I think that is all the formalities out of the way. Now to this morning's exciting webinar brought to you by SIOS. As we all know, as safety professionals or occupational health and hygiene professionals, the Minister of Employment and Labour has given notice that he intends, in terms of Section 43 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, to make these regulations into schedule. The Minister has given 90 days from the date of publication of this notice, which was on the 31st of July, to submit comments on these draft regulations. Just as a matter of interest, SIOS has opened a platform on our technical forum online on our website, and we ask members to please comment and give their comments on that forum, which SIOS will collate by means of a technical committee that SIOS has formed that will submit collective comments on behalf of our 16,000 members before the 90 days, which we will do for you. Right, this morning's presentation, we are very pleased and honored, and perhaps I can ask Jabulile if she can now maybe share her camera with us so she can come on when I introduce her. Good morning, Jabulila. Thank you and welcome to this webinar. I see we've got heading close on 500 registrants that's already logged in. So they are keen to hear what you got to say this morning. So Jabulile is a specialist occupational hygiene at the Department of Employment and Labour, and she will be unpacking these regulations for us this morning. Not only unpacking them, but also indicate and share with us what is new and what has been removed, which will make your task as a health and safety professional possibly a bit easier when you also have to comment to your employer, or if you want to understand the reasons behind the draft regulations. Jabu is a specialist, as I indicated, occupational hygiene at the Department of Employment and Labour. She's responsible for these regulations, which is the Hazardous Biological Agents regulations. Jabu is qualified as an environmental health officer, having a BTEC in environmental health. She is presently studying for a master's in public health at Wits University. In May 1989, she started her career practicing as an environmental health officer with the Department of Health. And in July 27, she moved to the Department of Employment and Labour. What a good move that was, Jabu, to join the Occupational and Hygiene Directorate. Welcome to this webinar this morning. I'm going to now ask you to please share your sound, your video, which you've done already, and also your screen.
Yes.
And please have a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, for the welcome. And good morning to all the colleagues who've attended this webinar. I hope all will go well with the technology. I hope everyone can see the presentation.
That's perfect. Thank you, Jabu.
All right.
Thank you.
Colleagues, on the presentation, I just want to explain, I'm not gonna go through each and every section of the regulation because other regulations were left as they were. Therefore, I will but indicate that which ones I'm not gonna dwell on because my aim for this presentation is to dwell on those sections of the regulation that have been amended or reviewed. So my presentation is going to have two colors. It's black and green. The green color will indicate the new information that has been included on the regulation, and the black is the one that is already existing in the current regulation. Unfortunately, I could not do maybe the red color to see which information has been removed because the presentation was becoming too clumsy. But I hope you will go back to the regulation and check where we made some additional changes or removed some of the information. I hope that is clear. Okay. Can I switch off the video?
Jabu, if it's okay for you to leave it on, you're not full screen, so it's nice for the attendees to see your face while you're doing it, if that's okay with you.
Okay. I'm just
you.
struggling to get the topic.
Is it on your presentation?
Yeah, I just want to remove this screen down. Okay.
No problem. You can take your time. No problem.
Okay. Under the introduction, I just want to explain what biological agents are. We say biological agents are living organisms or products of living organisms. They include viruses, bacteria, and fungi, and their metabolites, as well as parasitic worms and plants. Many microbes reproduce rapidly, require minimal resources for survival. They are a potential danger in a wide variety of occupational settings. Hazardous biological agents are infectious and toxic, but they can also cause allergic reactions, some types of asthma, and organic dust toxic syndrome. So that's just a brief background of what HBAs are. The contents of the regulations are as follows. Firstly, we've got definitions, scope of application, classification of biological agents, information and training, duties of persons who might be exposed to HBA, risk assessment by the employer or self-employed person, monitoring exposure at the workplace, medical surveillance, records, control of exposure to HBA, personal protective equipment and facilities, maintenance and monitoring of control measures and facilities, prohibitions, labeling, packaging, transporting and storage, special measures for health and veterinary isolation facilities, special measures for laboratories and animal rooms and industrial processes, disposal of HBA, hazardous biological agents, health and safety technical committee, offenses and penalties, short title, Annexure A, Annexure B, Annexure C, and Annexure D. Now coming to the definitions, as I've mentioned, the green stuff means there's new addition to the definitions, and the black text means that the text is there in the current regulations, and some of the text might have been removed on the text that is black. But as I've said, I couldn't indicate which one has been removed because the presentation was becoming sort of messy. So the inclusion is, we say there's a definition for biohazard, which means potential source of harm caused by biological agent or toxin. Then on the biological agent, it means any microorganism, cell, or organic material with plant, animal, or human origin, including any which have been genetically modified. Then we come to control measures, means measures that remove or reduce the exposure of persons at the workplace. Decontamination means the procedure that eliminates or reduces biological agents to a level that does not cause harm with respect to the transmission of infection or other adverse effects. If I can give an example, I'm just going to take this example. We've got decontamination in the current regulation, but it reads as follows so that you can compare the two. It says the current one means to remove as far as is reasonably practicable all inanimate objects by way of sweeping, cleaning, washing, ventilating, or any other process aimed at removing the contaminants. So you can see, even if the text is black, but there has been some changes on the present definition. So I hope when you go through this, you will then understand the changes that were made. Under diagnostic laboratory means a workplace where all diagnostic or other screening procedures are performed on any biological agent or material. Then we've got the new definition, which is equipment, means a device designed to process HBA. Then HBA definition has been there in the current regulation, but it has been amended. It means a hazardous biological agent which may cause an infection, allergy, or toxicity, or otherwise create a hazard to human health, subdivided into the following groups. So the groups I did not indicate here because they are existing in the current regulation. Laboratory means a room or part of a building equipped for experimentation, research, testing, or manufacture of drugs or chemicals, or which may manipulate microbiological agents. Then under safety equipment means equipment which is designed to prevent exposure. Standard precautions means a synthesis of the major features of universal precautions and body substance isolation, and applies to all persons coming into contact with potentially infected persons, animals or animal products, and potentially contaminated blood and other fluids in the workplace, and apply to all blood, all body fluids, and all other substances that are mentioned in the current regulation. Now we come to the scope of application. Subject to Regulation 2, these regulations shall apply to every employer and self-employed persons at the workplace where HBA is produced, processed, used, handled, stored, or transported, or applicable where an incident for which an indicative list is given in Annexure A to this regulation occurs that does not involve a deliberate intention to work with an HBA but may result in persons being exposed to HBA in the performance of his or her work. Regulations 8, 14, 15, 16, and 17 shall not apply to an employer or self-employed person at the workplace where the exposure is restricted to a Group 1 HBA. An example of the changes that were made here is under 1A. The current regulations say HBA, that is deliberately produced. So that is the word that has been deleted. Now we come to Regulation 3, which is classification of biological agents. The new addition is that the biological agents shall be assigned a classification of Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, or Group 4, according to hazard and categories of a contaminant. As Subregulation 2 and 3, there were no changes that were made. They are as they are in the current regulation, so I'm not going to go through them. Now we come to Regulation 4, that is information and training. We are saying an employer, after consultation with the Health and Safety Committee established for that section of the workplace, shall ensure that any employee at risk of being exposed or exposing others to HBA is comprehensively informed and trained on both practical aspects and theoretical knowledge with regard to the following. If you check on this, the Regulation 1 of Regulation 4.1, in the current regulation, it says an employer shall, before an employee is exposed or may be exposed to HBA, and after consultation with the Health and Safety Committee established for the section of the workplace, ensure that the employee is adequately and comprehensively informed and trained on both practical aspects and theoretical knowledge with regard to. Therefore, there have been some changes in the wording to this paragraph. Regard to the contents and scope of these regulations, potential risks to health caused by the exposure, measures to be taken by the employer to protect an employee against any risk of being exposed, importance of good housekeeping at the workplace, and personal hygiene requirements. Precautions to be taken by an employee to protect him or herself against the health associated with the exposure, including the wearing and use of protective clothing and respiratory protective equipment. The necessity, correct use, maintenance, and potential of safety equipment, facilities, and engineering control measures provided, necessity of medical surveillance, safe working procedures regarding the use, handling, labeling, and disposal of HbA at the workplace, procedures to be followed in the event of exposure, spillage, leakage, injury, or any similar emergency situation, and decontaminating or disinfecting contaminated areas, and the potential detrimental effect of exposure on the human reproductive process. Then we come to the Regulation 5, which is the duties of persons who might be exposed. So also you can see here there are green wording, that means they were included. Any person who is or might be exposed to HbA shall obey any lawful instruction given by or on behalf of the employer or self-employed person regarding the prevention of an uncontrolled release of an HbA, the adherence to instructions regarding environmental and health practices, personal hygiene, and good housekeeping. The appropriate use, I think the previous, in the current regulation, it says the wearing. And the committee felt that the wearing alone does not really give that impact that it needs to have. So we said the appropriate use of personal protective equipment and clothing as prescribed by this regulation, the appropriate use of personal samplers when necessary to measure personal exposure to airborne hazardous biological agents, the disposal of materials containing HbA, and the disinfection and decontamination of any site contaminated by an HbA. We continue with the duties of persons who might be exposed. The reporting during normal working hours for such medical examination or test as contemplated in Regulation 8.1, and information and training as contemplated in Regulation 4. Any person shall immediately report to the employer, the health and safety representative, or self-employed person any possible accidental exposure to HbA at the workplace, and the employer or self-employed person shall ensure that such incident is investigated and recorded in accordance with Regulation 9 of the General Administrative Regulations. Sorry, can I plug in my laptop before it dies down?
No problem, Jabu. Might be a good time for everyone to stretch those legs, get the blood flowing.
Okay. Okay, I'm good to go.
Thanks, Jabu.
All right. Okay, now we come to Regulation 6, the risk assessment by employer or self-employed person. I think this is the most important part of the work that we do and that needs to be done to ensure that employees are being protected. It says an employer or a self-employed person contemplated in Regulating 2 shall, after consultation with the relevant health and safety representative or relevant health and safety committee, conduct a risk assessment to determine if any exposure to HbA has occurred. When making the risk assessment as contemplated in Subregulation 1, the employer or self-employed person shall take into account as a minimum the following matters: the nature of the HBA to which an employee may be exposed and the possible route of exposure. I think this is important because sometimes when we visit the workplaces, they do identify the hazards and the risks, but in most cases, they don't indicate which way will the employees be exposed, meaning the root exposures most of the time are missing in the risk assessments. And also where the HBA might be present and in what physical form it is likely to be. And also the nature of the work and work processes. As you know that in any workplace, you might find HBAs in another section, but not in the other section. So it is important that the risk assessment do identify where the HBAs might be present and what work processes are being conducted in that section of the workplace. Also, what we've included is the current control measures in place, effectiveness of those control measures, and any reasonable deterioration in or failure thereof. As I've mentioned that most of the time, this is not really taken into consideration when conducting a risk assessment, the control measures that are already existing in the workplace. And also what effects the HBA can have on an employee, including pregnant and immunocompromised employees. As you know these days that we have those conditions that have an impact on the employee's immune system. Therefore, when an employer conducts a risk assessment, such employees need to be taken into consideration. An employer or a self-employed person shall conduct the risk assessment on the basis of all available information as far as is reasonably practicable, including the following: the classification of the HBA into the relevant risk group according to its level of risk of infection as contained in Annexure B. This is also the section that needs to be improved when employers conduct risk assessment, because sometimes they don't classify the hazardous biological agent that has been identified in the risk assessment. Also, taking into consideration the recommendations from the manufacturer, supplier, or a competent person regarding additional control measures necessary in order to protect the health of persons against such agents as a result of their work. We continue. Information on diseases that may be contracted as a result of the activities at the workplace. We know that exposure to certain hazardous biological agents will give rise to certain diseases. So that must be also included in the risk assessment. Potential allergic or toxic effects that may result from the activities at the workplace. As we've said that HBAs, they don't just cause diseases, they can also cause allergic reactions or toxic effects. Knowledge of diseases from which employees might be suffering and which may be aggravated by conditions at the workplace. As I've mentioned, there are employees who might be suffering from already existing conditions, maybe like asthma, and if they are exposed to hazardous biological agents, their asthma may be aggravated. The employer shall review the assessment required by Subregulation 1 at intervals not exceeding 2 years, or forthwith if there is a reason to suspect that the previous assessment is no longer valid or has been a change in a process involving an HBA. Also, if there has been a change in the methods, equipment, or procedures in the use, handling, control, or processing of HBA. As we know that we are in the era of COVID-19 these days, it was required of employers to review their risk assessment to also include measures that have been introduced for the control of exposure to COVID-19. The employer shall ensure that all employees and the relevant health and safety committee are informed of the results of the risk assessment and may comment thereon. This part was there in the beginning, but as the technical committee, we said it needs to come maybe here at the end when everything else has been done. Now coming to Regulation 7, monitoring exposure at the workplace. An employer shall ensure that the exposure of employees to an HBA is monitored in accordance with a validated procedure, sufficiently sensitive and of proven effectiveness. If I may just elaborate a bit here. Towards the end of these regulations, you will see that we have proposed the formation of the Technical Committee for Hazardous Biological Agents, whereby they will advise the Chief Inspector on matters related to HBAs. So one of the tasks that we felt that they need to consider is to validate the procedures that employers will put in place just to ensure that the exposure of employees to HBA is monitored. Also, we are saying that of a proven effectiveness in any case, which is requisite for ensuring the maintenance of adequate control of the exposure of employees to HBA as per risk assessment, or otherwise requisite for protecting the health of employees. The monitoring referred to in paragraph 1 shall take place at regular intervals and when any change occurs which may affect the exposure. The new addition under monitoring and exposure, we are saying the employer shall ensure that a suitable record of monitoring carried out for the purpose of this regulation is made and maintained, and that record or a suitable summary thereof is kept. Meaning that whenever there has been a monitoring that has been done, that record must be kept by the employer, where the record is a representative of the personal exposure of identifiable employees must be kept for at least 40 years, or where an employee is required by Regulation 8 to be under medical surveillance, an individual record of any monitoring carried out in accordance with this regulation shall be maintained, and kept in respect of that employee. So we are saying here, any monitoring, whether being of a personal nature or personal exposure, must be kept by the employer. Regulation 8 is medical surveillance. An employer shall ensure that an employee is under medical surveillance if the results of the assessment referred to in Regulation 6 indicate that an employee might have been exposed to HBA. And the exposure of the employee to any HBA hazardous to his or her health is such that an identifiable disease or adverse effect to his or her health may be related to the exposure, or there is a reasonable likelihood that the disease or effect may occur under particular conditions of his or her work, And there are techniques such as preclinical biomarkers where appropriate for detecting sensitization to allergens or an inflammatory response associated with exposure to diagnose indications of the disease or the effect as far as is reasonably practicable. I think this is also contained in the current regulation. An occupational health practitioner recommends that the relevant employee should be under medical surveillance, in which case the employer may call upon an occupational medicine practitioner to ratify the appropriateness of such recommendation. It's also in the current regulation. In order to comply with the provisions of sub-regulation 1, the employer shall, after extensive counseling and education, offer an employee the opportunity to have an initial health evaluation, which should be carried out by an occupational health practitioner immediately before or within 14 days after a person commences employment where any exposure exists or might exist. I think the emphasis here is that extensive counseling is required because people might be frightened to go for this initial health evaluation in case some of the diseases might come up. So it's important that employees are given extensive counseling and education before they undergo the health evaluation. It might, which comprises of an evaluation of the employee's medical and occupational history, a physical examination, and any biological tests and other appropriate medical tests, or any other essential examination that is the opinion of the occupational health practitioner is desirable in order to enable the practitioner to do a proper evaluation. Periodic medical examination and tests in cases where HBA is known to be capable of causing persistent or latent infections which, in the light of present knowledge, are undiagnosable until signs or symptoms develop, or can have particular long incubation periods, can result in an illness which is recurrent in spite of treatment, and are known to have serious long-term effects. All tests and examination as contemplated in paragraph A and B shall be conducted according to a written medical protocol following current best practices, guidelines, national or international. So also this is part also of the committee that will look into what are the current best practices that are being used or guidelines when it comes to the medical examinations. The employer shall, in accordance with the Regulation 8 of the General Administrative Regulation, investigate and record all incidents that result or might result in infections or death of an employee. All occupational health practitioners shall submit to the Health and Safety Committee for approval a written protocol for procedures to be followed when dealing with abnormal results. I think this is contained in the current regulation as it is. Under records, that is Regulation 9. An employer shall keep records of all training, assessments, monitoring results, and medical surveillance reports required by Regulation 4, 6, 7, and 8, respectively, provided that personal medical records shall be made available only to an occupational health practitioner. The current regulation does not require the records of training to be kept. So we thought that it's important that also the records of training be kept, because most of the time when we visit the workplaces, the employer would say, yes, I've trained the employees on this and that, but when you request records, none are available. So that we can also check what training was provided to employees. Is it relevant to the hazardous biological agents or not? Number 2, an employer shall keep a record of the examinations and tests carried out in terms of the regulation 12B and of any repairs resulting from these investigations and tests, which records shall be kept for at least we've removed 3 years to 5 years. So we are recommending the keeping of records for 5 years. As you know, some of the diseases, they show up after some years. Also, those records will help when there are some investigations that need to be conducted, especially on the issues of repairs, like of engineering control measures and the stuff. Employers subject to the formal written consent of an employee allow the representative of the employee to peruse the records with respect to that particular employee, make the records of all risk assessments and monitoring results available for perusal by the health and safety representative or health and safety committee. This is in the current regulations. Keep all risk assessments and monitoring results for a minimum period of 40 years. Keep all medical surveillance records for a minimum period of 40 years. And if the employer ceases activities, all those records shall be handed over to the relevant chief director, provincial operations, following also the HPCSA guidelines. And keep a record of the examination and tests carried out in terms of regulation 12B and of any repairs resulting from these investigation and tests, which records shall be kept for at least 5 years, as I've mentioned before. A self-employed person shall keep records of all risk assessment for a minimum period of 40 years, and if the self-employed person ceases activities, all those records shall be handed over to the relevant chief director, provincial operations. Now we come to regulation 10, that is control of exposure to HBA. An employer and self-employed person shall ensure that as a result of their activities, exposure of persons to HBA in the working environment is either prevented or, where this is not reasonably practicable, controlled such that exposure is highly improbable. And the following standard precautions are implemented to reduce the risk of transmission of HBA from recognized and unrecognized sources of infection in a workplace, including hand washing, gloves, face or eye protection, protective clothing, safety equipment, and environmental controls. I think with the present pandemic of COVID-19, we are mostly familiar with this standard precautions that we are implementing currently for COVID-19. Where reasonably practicable, the employer or self-employed person shall control the exposure of persons to an HBA in the working environment by applying the following measures. Where appropriate has been removed, limiting the amount of HBA used, which might contaminate the working environment, limiting the number of employees who might be exposed, introducing measures for the control of exposure, which shall include any combination of the following contamination control concepts, meaning that we are not saying the employer need to focus on one measure, but the combination of the measures listed below is recommended. Separation of different infectious processes from each other and from people. Barrier isolation of process or agent. Local exhaust ventilation. Environmental air dilution or disinfection. Positive static air pressure differential from infectious process to human occupied zones. Suppression of emissions of an airborne HBA. Access control to prevent unauthorized access. And immediately accessible emergency personnel or environmental disinfection. Introducing appropriate work procedures that employees must follow where materials are handled, used, processes are carried out, or incidents might occur that could give rise to the exposure of an employee to an HBA. And such procedures shall include documented instructions to ensure the safe handling, use, and disposal of HBA, the proper use and maintenance of process machinery, installation equipment, tools, and local exhaust and general ventilation system, the regular cleaning of machinery and work areas by vacuum cleaners fitted with a suitable filtration that prevents contamination of the environment. Also, what I can say here, it is important that whatever procedures that they are going to use must be documented, because most of the time you find that they will tell you we are doing this and that, or the procedure that we follow is this and that, but it's not documented anywhere. So we don't have proof that they are following what they are saying verbally. So it is important that those instructions need to be documented. Still on the control of exposure to HBA, that a system is in place that identifies the need for early corrective action from changes to work procedures and practices. As I've mentioned also, when it comes to the risk assessment, that sometimes you'll have to review we are saying you need to review the risk assessment because there have been maybe changes in the work processes or changes in the equipment. Therefore, the employer needs to have a system in place whereby it's going to inform or identify when there is a need to do early corrective actions. Like maybe we say, as we say, the risk assessment must be reviewed maybe within a period of 2 years, but if there is a need that the risk assessment must be reviewed earlier, there needs to be a system in place that will indicate that. Displaying the biohazard sign shown in Annex C to these regulations and other relevant warning signs, specifying procedures for taking, handling, and processing samples that might contain HBA. Then we comes to Regulation 11, that is personal protective equipment and facilities. If it is not reasonably practicable to ensure that the exposure of an employee is controlled as contemplated in Regulation 10, the employer shall, in the case of an airborne HBA, provide the employee with suitable respiratory protective equipment and protective clothing. An HBA that can be absorbed through the skin, provide the employee with suitable impermeable personal protective equipment. Then where a respiratory protective equipment is provided, the employer shall ensure that the relevant equipment is correctly selected, fitted, and properly used. Well, I've seen during this COVID-19, some of the respiratory protective equipment that is given to employees. Others are fitting well, others are not. So it's important that the RPE that is given to employees is correctly selected and fitting properly for use. The reusable equipment is kept in good condition and efficient working order. We know that there are RPEs that you can reuse and others that you cannot reuse. They are the disposable ones. So the reusable ones must be kept in a good condition and also in an efficient working order. Information, instructions, training, and supervision which would be necessary with regard to the use of the equipment are known to the employees. So we are emphasizing the fact that employees need to be informed, trained, and supervised when wearing the PPE. The reusable equipment is kept in good condition and efficient working order. An employer shall, as far as is reasonably practicable, not issue personal protective equipment which has been used to an employee unless it is capable of being decontaminated and sterilized prior to use. Provide separate containers or storage facilities for protective equipment and protective clothing when not in use, and take steps to ensure that all protective equipment and protective clothing not in use are stored in a demarcated area with proper access control, and provide sufficient hazardous waste containers for disposal of used personal protective equipment. Therefore, it's important that wherever PPE is stored, the access is controlled to those. As we know that these days, PPE just disappears. Also, an employer shall, as far as is reasonably practicable, ensure that all contaminated personal protective clothing issued is cleaned and handled in accordance with the following procedures. Where such clothing is cleaned on the premises of the employer, care shall be taken to prevent contamination during handling, transporting, and cleaning. Where clothing is sent off the premises to a contractor for cleaning purposes, the clothing shall be placed in impermeable, tightly sealed, color-coded containers, and such containers shall be clearly identified with a biohazard label as depicted in Annexure C to these regulations as contaminated. Where clothing from facilities handling HBA risk group 3 and risk group 4 agent is sent off the premises for any purposes, these must first be decontaminated. As we know that with risk group 3 and especially risk group 4, it's those hazardous biological agents that we say they are in a higher risk group 4. They are higher risk group. As you know that with risk group 4, there is no prophylaxis or treatment. Therefore, they are highly contagious. Therefore, we are saying if the facilities are handling HBA risk group 3, risk group 4, such clothing before they are sent off from the premises, they need to be decontaminated. Ensure that the contractor, as contemplated in subregulation 4B, is fully informed of the requirements and of these regulations and precautions to be taken regarding, I'm sorry, the slide is cutting there.
Need some assistance, Jobber?
No, I just want to, the slide, it's missing the last line.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah. Okay, Ensure that the contractor, as contemplated in sub-regulation 4B, is fully informed of the requirements of this regulation and the precautions to be taken regarding the handling of contaminated clothing. Subject to the provisions of sub-regulation 4B, an employer shall ensure that no person removes dirty or contaminated personal protective equipment and personal protective clothing from the premises, provided that where contaminated personal protective equipment has to be disposed of, it shall be treated as HBA waste as contemplated in Regulation 17. This is in the current regulation. Subject to the provisions of the facilities regulations, an employer shall, where reasonably practicable, provide employees using personal protective equipment and clothing as contemplated in Regulation 1 with adequate washing facilities which are readily accessible and located in an area where the facilities will not become contaminated in order to enable the employees to meet the standard of personal hygiene consistent with the adequate control of exposure and to avoid the spread of HBA. This is also in the current regulation, and I think it's even more applicable now with the COVID-19. Then 2 separate lockers labeled protective clothing and general clothing respectively, and ensure that the general and protective clothing is kept separately in the lockers concerned, and separate clean and contaminated change rooms if the employer uses or processes HBA to the extent that the HBA could endanger the health of persons outside the workplace. Can I request a 5 minutes break just to get some water?
Yeah, yeah,
throat is
please.
dry.
No problem. I'm sure everyone will wait that 5 minutes for you, Jabo. It's been an interesting presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, everyone. While Job is taking a quick break there, just a quick reminder that we have 2 other webinars lined up for you. You will see in the chat box the links were provided. In fact, tomorrow is another one on wellness in the workplace, presented by Professor Andrew Sharman from the UK. He's the IOS president at the moment. And then there's another exciting webinar coming up on the 7th of September, where SIOS will take part in the Electro Mining Connect webinars. In fact, we're on day 1, which is the 7th of September, on a very interesting topic that will be presented by a panelist of experts on ventilation as being a key barrier for COVID. I think you have all picked up of late that the more ventilation, the better ventilation, the less chance of exposure. So don't miss those ones. Also, just to inform you that the SIOS has opened an online platform on our technical forum platform for members to post their comments on these regulations. So please make use of that if you're a SIOS member. You can also go and view the other members' comments. In addition, SIOS has appointed a technical committee specifically to review these draft regulations, but it will be great to have all your comments in as well. Obviously, we will make use of the questions that's been posted here as well, which will be fielded just now by Garth, and we can get the answers from Jabu. But in the meantime, please feel free as a SIOS member to go and submit your comments on the draft Hazardous Biological Agents regulations on the technical forum on SIOS. Just also a reminder, while we make use of this opportunity of the break, that this webinar is CPD verified with 2 CPD points, and afterwards members can claim the points. And now it's time to say welcome back, Jabu, over to you.
Good to go, Jabu.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Now we are coming to the maintenance of control measures and facilities. An employer shall ensure that a documented risk-based protocols are developed, maintained, and available at the workplace for all control measures, equipment, and facilities provided in terms of Regulation 6, 10, and 11, and which include performance parameters and minimum acceptance criteria, performance monitoring methodology and intervals, routine maintenance requirements, specifications and intervals, relevant standards, regulations, and manufacturers' requirements, and minimum competency and training required to perform monitoring and maintenance activities. I think with what we are proposing here is because there are different control measures in place for the prevention or minimizing the exposure to HBAs. Therefore, we are proposing that for each control measure that is in place, there should be a documented risk-based protocols when it comes to the maintenance and monitoring and the performance of those control measures in place, including the monitoring methodology and the intervals of when should the monitoring or maintenance be conducted. Because we have seen that there's no one size that fits all. Each and every control measure in place requires a different maintenance or monitoring activities that needs to be controlled. And also that minimum competency and training required to perform monitoring and maintenance activities. This has been seen also, especially when it comes to the biosafety cabinets, that a minimum requirement is required for that person to undergo some form of training to be able to maintain or monitor the biosafety cabinets, and also the equipment that must be used for those control facilities. All control measures, equipment, and facilities provided in terms of Regulations 6, 10, and 11 are maintained in good working order and in accordance with the protocols referred to in A above. Thorough examination and tests of control measures, equipment, and facilities provided in terms of Regulations 6, 10, and 11 are carried out in accordance with the protocols referred to in A above, but at intervals not exceeding 24 months. The protocols referred to in A above comply with any applicable guideline issued by the Chief Inspector. So in this case, if you read this regulation in the current regulation, there's been a lot of changes and for this regulation 12, because we had challenges. We are having challenges currently with this regulation. So I hope we will receive some inputs in this part of the regulation. Labeling, packaging, transporting, and storage. An employer or self-employed person shall, as far as is reasonably practicable, take steps to ensure that all HBA under his or her control in storage, transit, or being distributed are properly contained and controlled to prevent the spread of contamination from the workplace. Transport of HBA are performed with due consideration of the National Road Traffic Act, Chapter 8, Transport of Dangerous Goods and Substances, Act 93 of 1996, and or the International Air Transport Association Infectious Substances Shipping Regulations. Authorization for the transport and storage of biological agents as required by the National Health Act, regulations relating to the registration of microbiological laboratories and the acquisition, importation, handling, maintenance, and supply of human pathogens, Regulation 178, the Non-Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction Act of 1993, declaration of certain biological goods and technologies as controlled goods and control measures applicable to such goods, Regulation number 19, the Animal Diseases Act of 1984, and the Genetically Modified Organisms Act of 1997 where applicable. So if you can check, many regulations and acts are involved when it comes to especially the transportation and storage of hazardous biological agents. Okay, what I need to indicate is that under the current act, we've got prohibitions. So I did not include them in this presentation because they remain as they are. There has not been any changes to the regulation 13 of the prohibitions. So they will still be applicable. Then we come to the disposal of HBA. As I've mentioned that most of the text that is in black, it's already in the current regulation and it has not been changed. So I'm not gonna read through that. I will just go straight to number D. An employer or self-employed person as contemplated in Regulation 2 shall ensure that all HBA waste that can cause exposure is disposed of only on sites specifically designated for this purpose in terms of the National Environmental Management Waste Act of 2008 in such a manner that it does not cause a hazard inside or outside the site concerned. Ensure that all employees involved in the collection, transport, and disposal of HBA waste and who may be exposed to that waste are provided with suitable personal protective equipment, and ensure that if the services of waste disposal contractor is used, a provision is incorporated into the contract stating that the contractor shall comply with the provisions of these regulations. This is the new inclusion into the regulation. I also want to mention that in the current regulation, we've got special measures for health and veterinary isolation facilities, also special measures for laboratory, animal rooms, and industrial processes. Those regulations, they remain as in the current regulation. So there has not been any changes made to those regulations. That's why they are not included in this presentation. Hazardous Biological Agents Health and Safety Technical Committee. The Chief Inspector must establish an HBA Health and Safety Technical Committee, which must consist of a person who is to be the chairperson, 2 persons designated by the Chief Inspector from the employees of the Department of Labor, 3 persons designated by employers' organization to represent employers, 3 persons designated by employees' organizations representing the Federation of Unions, 1 representative of each of the professional bodies recognized by the Chief Inspector, 1 person from the field of HBA representing a higher educational institution. And the Chief Inspector must appoint members of the HBA Health and Safety Technical Committee for a period that he or she may determine at the time of appointment, provided that the Chief Inspector may, after having afforded a member a reasonable opportunity to respond, discharge him or her at any time for reasons that are fair and just, and appoint a new member in his or her place. The HBA Health and Safety Technical Committee must advise the Chief Inspector on HBA-related matters, including but not limited to codes, standards, and training requirements, make recommendations, and submit reports to the Chief Inspector regarding any matter to which these regulations relate, advise the Chief Inspector regarding any matter referred to the HBA Health and Safety Technical Committee by the Chief Inspector, perform any other function for the administration of a provision of these regulations that may be requested by the Chief Inspector, and conduct its work in accordance with the instructions and rules of the conduct framed by the Chief Inspector. So this is a totally new inclusion into the current draft regulations. We saw a need for this committee because as you will see that under Annex B, there is a list of hazardous biological agents that have been listed. Therefore, from time to time, there might be a need to revisit such a list. Therefore, this committee will be crucial in matters related thereof to such issues. Under the annexures on the current regulation, Annexure A, which is an indicative list of incidents, that annexure remained as it is. There were no changes made to Annexure A. That's why it's not part of the current presentation. There were some few changes made under Annexure B, especially in terms of the list, but I'm gonna go through it. Annexure C has been removed from the draft regulations because when the committee went through Annexure C, it's more of the guidelines, or it gives the more explanatory note of some kind. Therefore, we thought that it would be best to put Annexure C under the explanatory guide that will form part of these regulations. Therefore, Annexure C in the current regulation has been removed, and Annexure D is a biohazard sign, remains, and Annexure E and F have been combined, but you will see as I continue with the presentation. I just wanted to inform you about the changes when it comes to the annexures. Annexure B, the attached list must be read in conjunction with the hazardous biological agents regulations, and in particular Regulation 3. Biological agents listed are categorized in risk groups on the basis of their ability to cause human disease by infection, allergy, and/or toxicity, potential to cause epidemics or pandemics, endemicity in South Africa, and availability of curative or prophylactic treatment. Risk group 1, a microorganism known not to or unlikely to cause human disease. Risk group 2, a pathogen that may cause human disease, but unlikely to pose serious hazard to laboratory workers, the community, and the environment. Specific treatment or vaccines may be available to manage or prevent infection with these pathogens. Risk group 3, a pathogen that may cause serious human disease, but does not typically spread from human to human. Treatment and vaccines may be available to manage or prevent infection with these pathogens. Risk group 4, a pathogen that may cause serious human disease and may be readily transmissible from human to human. Specific treatment and preventative measures are typically not available for the diseases caused by these pathogens. In allocating biological agents to a risk group, account is not taken of effects on those whose susceptibility may be affected for one or other reason, such as pre-existing disease, medication, compromised immunity, pregnancy, or breastfeeding. Workplace-specific risks to such workers should be considered as per risk assessment as in Regulation 6. Biological agents that have not been classified for inclusion into Group 2 to 4 in the list are not implicitly classified as Group 1. All viruses that have been isolated in humans and that have not been assessed and allocated to a group in the list are to be classified in Group 2 as a minimum, except where there is evidence that they are unlikely to cause disease in humans. I think this is clear that just because the virus is not yet classified into a risk group, you cannot just take it to Group 1, because it unless there is information that it's unlikely to cause a disease in humans, it is when that then we can classify it in Group 1. But if we are not sure, the minimum group that that virus can be classified is Group 2. The text that is in black is currently in the existing regulations, so I will just go to number 7. The requirements as to containment consequent upon the classification of parasites apply only to stages in the life cycle of the parasite in which it is liable to be infectious, allergic, or toxic to humans. The list also gives a separate indication where biological agents are capable of causing allergic or toxic reactions and where registered vaccine is available for use in the Republic of South Africa. The indications are identified by the following notation: A, possible allergic effects, T, toxin production, and V, vaccine available. The selection of control measures for biological agents should take into account the fact that there are no exposure limits for them, their ability to replicate and to infect, cause allergic or toxic effects at very low doses means that exposure may have to be reduced to levels that are diminishingly low. As I've said in my introduction, that microorganisms, they are living organisms. They replicate at any time, also depending on the environment in which they are found. So it's very difficult now that we can have the exposure limit for the microorganisms, unlike for example, the chemicals, because chemicals are not replicating, they are not living organisms. Not all the listed measures will be required in every case. The assessment may indicate, for example, that a specific mode of transmission and route of infection, allergy, or toxic effect is required. A susceptible host is needed. There is low prevalence of the infection, allergy or toxic effect in that particular activity, and that illness is easily treatable, leading to rapid and complete recovery. Therefore, when you look into the draft regulations, there are different tables that have been put there indicating the different categories of biological agents. Table 1, prescribed risk groups for parasitic agents, and it's in alphabetical order. So all those agents you will find under table 1 for parasites. Table 2 is a risk group for fungal agents. Then table 3 is risk group for bacteria, rickettsia, and mycoplasmas. And then table 4 is risk group for viruses. This list pertains primarily to human pathogens, but also include other viruses that may be frequently used in experimentation, for example, baculovirus for protein expression, or veterinary pathogens that will be likely processed in medical laboratories, for example, BSL-4 agents. Unassigned species refer to species not specifically listed here, and they are also in alphabetic order per family. So the groups and the agents are in the draft regulations. Therefore, I would request colleagues to look into those agents in the different risk groups as contained in the draft regulations. I couldn't really include them here, otherwise we're gonna take the whole day. And then, as I've indicated, that indications concerning containment measures and containment levels for laboratories and industrial processes. Here we have meshed Annexure E and F in the current regulation. So we are saying for group 1, biological agents, including live attenuated vaccines, no physical containment measures are prescribed below. For work with group 1 biological agents, the principles of good occupational safety and hygiene should be observed. Where hazardous biological agents can be transmitted through suspended aerosols over long distances, they are classified as airborne spread in the table below. Mechanisms of transmission, including contact, droplet, and vector spread, are considered as non-airborne spread below. For group 2, 3, and 4 agents, it may be appropriate to select and combine containment requirements from different categories below on the basis of a risk assessment related to any particular process or part of process. So this is just an example of how we have crafted the containment measures under different processes. You will see that there is containment measure and then the containment levels, whereby the cross indicate mandatory for animal containment facilities, and then the arrow is mandatory for industrial processes, which must be looked together with the Annexure A of the indicative lists. And then also the dot, the circle and a dot inside is mandatory for suit laboratories. So this is the way in which the containment measures in the draft regulations have been crafted. Also, I will request the colleagues to go through the list and see if it's covering every aspect that it needs to be covered. So I could not also include the whole table for this presentation. Sorry. Most people ask that then what happens after this? I'm just going to take you through the steps that we take before the regulation can be promulgated. Okay, we've already done step one where a technical committee was approved to review the regulations. We have drafted the regulations. We got ECO's approval for the minister to approve the regulations for public comments. So we are currently in step 4, where in step 5, whereby the publication of draft regulations has been done for 90 days. Therefore, come 30 October, that will be the end, the last day for people to bring in their comments on these regulations. After we've received the comments, we're gonna consolidate, the technical committee is gonna consolidate and consider all the public comments that have been received. Then from there, we will resubmit the draft regulations with the input from the public to ACOS, that is the Advisory Council for Occupational Health and Safety for the Minister, to look into the resubmitted draft regulations. When ACOS approve those draft regulations, then we're gonna obtain legal opinion from the state law advisors. Then the draft will undergo also language check and editing. After that, it must undergo socio-economic impact assessment system. Then it will go back to ACOS for final approval before it goes to the minister for promulgation. So it's still a long way to go for these regulations, but we hope it will be quicker. I thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very, very much, Jabu. That is a comprehensive and detailed presentation indeed. If I can ask you to just hang on for a couple of more seconds or a couple of more minutes, we now got the tedious task of just fielding some of those important questions that came through. Just for the attendees, it's impossible for us to go through all those questions, and therefore I have appointed and asked Garth Hunter, which has become a bit of an expert on these Q&As, to please go through the questions as they were coming through. Garth categorized them, he grouped some of them together, he also prioritized them, and unfortunately we will not be able to field any questions as indicated that is not related to these draft hazardous biological agents regulations. So Garth, thank you. If you can maybe go through them as quickly as possible so we can field as many as possible, and thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Niels, and thank you, Jabu, for that very comprehensive job you did actually on going through the regulations. And I think it's also the interest just on these set of regulations. Before, these are regulations which nobody really understood or kind of thought they had very limited application. But certainly COVID has brought them to the fore. And we've seen that actually in the questions where people are asking questions around COVID, how they apply to COVID. And just the first 2 questions I'm going to ask just relate then to scope. And they're not necessarily posed as scope questions, but I know going through the regulations, they are really scope questions. And Siolo asks an interesting question, adds, perhaps it's the understanding you could bring as to how the regulations apply to an incident or exposure during work. And Siolo says is that heritage buildings often exhibit what is called a sick building syndrome, and that will be prevalent to the occupants where they'll often fall sick or suffer allergies after long exposure. Is this as well regarded as an HBA, seeing there might be toxins or spores released through the atmosphere due to old aesthetics of the building? And Jabu, how does this relate to an incident or exposure?
Okay. Is it heritage buildings?
Yes, it's just an old building or any building really. It might be somebody's house where there's a workplace where there's actually then mold or spores of fungi or some HBA.
Yes. As I've said, HBA is any living microorganisms, and we've got fungi, we've got parasites, we've got viruses. So yes, these HBA regulations will be applicable to those environments.
Okay. Then perhaps a follow-up question is that relates to COVID, and I think our lives have been changed by COVID. And the question is, if an external company is going to do decontamination or sanitizing when a positive case has been reported, must they wear hazmat suits with PPE, or can they only wear normal clothes with a mask and gloves?
As we know that with COVID-19, we are saying that it's also a biological agent. Therefore, you need to wear a proper PPE to conduct the decontamination. So the risk assessment of the employer must indicate which protective clothing or equipment should be worn when a person is going to decontaminate the workplace.
Would you then consider then a COVID case as being an incident under these regulations?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, and then so by implication, what you're saying is there's an incident and also there's exposure then to employees at that workplace.
Yeah, remember, we even in terms of the compensation, we say if an employee has been proven that the exposure has been at work, they can apply for compensation to be compensated when they test positive for
Thanks, Jabu.
COVID-19.
Then the next question asks, as I know this is a question which is asked across the regulations, who's a competent person?
Yeah. In fact, when I was drafting the presentation, I saw it as a gap that as a technical committee, maybe we overlooked at it. But
yes.
We would appreciate it if we can get inputs on people regarding what is it that they're saying about the competent person. But we've also identified that maybe we need to have define what a competent person is in terms of these regulations.
So perhaps also in terms of these regulations, I think because there's so many unknowns and also the roles of different people and perhaps they're not familiar to, certainly I think the broader occupational health and safety community at large, is that who would you see these groups of people potentially being actually competent persons? Do you have an idea of that?
Yeah, when you look under the maintenance of control to exposure, as I've said, with the current regulation, it has been sort of a challenge. So the way we have crafted it, we are saying that a person need to have at least a minimum or just an understanding, must undergo just a training in terms of understanding the maintenance of the control measures. So it will be crafted along those lines.
Okay, great. And then I guess people are interested in understanding who the players in this are. And there's a question, who are the members of your proposed technical committee, the TC that you have established? Just what backgrounds they come from?
Yeah, we looking at looking at those who will be representing the employers. It's standard. Employers and unions, you can't do away with. We need those people. Also, it will be specialists in the field of hazardous biological agents, like the researchers or the medical doctors, the occupational medical practitioners, also specialists in the field at the higher education institutions. I think it's listed under the categories there of who are we looking for, within that committee.
So it's interesting you mentioned specialists because the next question relates to then, I guess, the role of those specialists actually within the regulations. What we've seen then in terms of the chemical regulations, in terms of asbestos, lead, and all these other regulations, the role of then AIAs under SANAS. And so the question relates then to both monitoring and maintenance of controls. And Linda Grunding from SANAS, she asks, Morning, we'd like to know why accreditation was removed from the draft HBA regulations in terms of AIA accreditation.
Okay. It was because of the issue of competency, because we've done I think last year, when I said we had a challenge with these regulations, especially under the maintenance of control of equipment and facilities. So when we were, looking for information and trying to control the maintenance of these engineering control measures, we have found that competency presently is lacking, and also the equipment that needs to be used, and also the processes that are used to maintain these control measures. So we saw it presently, the maintenance of especially the biosafety cabinet is done by the importers and the manufacturers of those cabinets, because their people have undergone some form of training and they've got the necessary equipment to conduct those control measures. Within our AIAs presently, that competency is lacking.
Another question then, isn't there an opportunity to build that competency within the AIAs and actually bring it under control? Because we also see that in monitoring that typically AIAs would have to do the monitoring. And what's the thinking around that in relation to monitoring? I understand the controls are which you've answered already. So in relation to the monitoring, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of monitoring, as we have said that with HBAs, we don't have an occupational exposure limit currently. Therefore, it has been very challenging for the technical committee, but we also welcome the suggestions, because we've said that when we want to, the issue of monitoring faces a challenge because of this issue of these HBAs, they are replicating, and we don't have the occupational exposure limit currently. But we invite inputs on these matters, because that's why we are bringing this for public comments.
Garth, if I may
Okay.
interrupt on this question,
Yes.
I do believe this is exactly why the regulations are out for comment, and properly motivated comments and suggestions, as mentioned, is the time to be now.
Sure.
Yes.
All right. So then in terms of then the monitoring, Jabu, is that the question is asked then, how often does the monitoring have to be done? Do you have an idea of that?
As I've said, that what we've seen, that engineering control measures, their monitoring, it's not the same. It's not one size fits all. Depending on the manufacturer's recommendation, then that will be followed. Okay,
fine. Then a question is asked, what is meant by validated procedures? And I think that it's the word is validated. How would you view something as being validated? Who would do that validation?
Okay, I think I've explained that maybe, but the people missed it. As I've said, we are proposing the formation of the technical committee. And one of their duties as the experts in the field will be to do exactly that, validate those procedures and protocols that are recommended.
Okay, would you see that then they go out into the field, or that people could submit them procedures or not? Or how would that work?
No. Okay, people will submit the procedures, and then the technical committee will review them and see if they validate those protocols, looking at the international or national guidelines that are in existence.
All right, great, thank you. In terms of the HBA regulations, does COVID-19 testing for employees in the general outside of the healthcare sector qualify as biological monitoring, biological effects monitoring?
Outside the healthcare sector.
Yeah, so general, let's say we've got the COVID pandemic, which is going on at the moment. If then employers are then doing testing for people who suspected to be COVID-19 positive, does that qualify under these regulations as biological monitoring or biological effects monitoring?
Remember, HBA's regulations are not only applicable in the healthcare sector, they are applicable at all workplaces where there is a presence of any hazardous biological agent.
Okay. All right, thanks. And then there's a lot of confusion about PPE and HBA. And we've seen there's just a lot of questions on that. And what is hazardous waste? And is there a difference then of handling PPE in terms of being hazardous waste inside and outside of the healthcare sector?
Okay, when I was also reading through the recommendations from WHO, where it says that if the waste or the waste where if there hasn't been any a person who is okay, there's a difference between the presence of a person who has been identified maybe as COVID-19 and the area need to be decontaminated, then that waste will be a healthcare waste. But if it has just been a waste whereby there hasn't been a positive case or an area has to be decontaminated, that waste, like if I visit an employer's workplace, maybe to conduct an inspection, I will wear the PPE, maybe the gloves, the mask, the whatever. But that PPE is not gonna be a healthcare risk waste. It's just gonna go into the ordinary general waste because there's no contamination in that waste.
Okay, and then also then somebody asked a question related to then the if you saw then fabric masks as then being actually worn for the protection or potentially transferring or transmitting HBA, would that then the employer actually cleaning those masks, is that considered acceptable under these regulations?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
So if somebody's wearing actually a fabric mask in terms
Cloth
of
mask.
cloth mask to protect against or protect others against COVID-19 as an isolation device, and then the employer is then people are taking those masks home to clean, would that be considered, does that fall under these regulations? Is that considered acceptable under these regulations?
Cloth mask, it's a challenge, but presently I don't think they do fall under the HBA regulations because they are publicly worn by everybody, and it's just a suggestion that everybody must protect themselves. That's why even when you read, I'm just going to digress a bit, with our directive from the Department of Labor, we have said whereby PPE is required for specific workplace or section, the employer must not rely on the cloth mark, but must issue a proper PPE for those employees.
Okay, great. That's helpful guidance. I know this is new territory. I mean, for all of us have had to grow and learn and through this process, and it's certainly not easy. So then a question also relates to this, and I mean, I was asked the question last week, I think it was, that how long does the SARS-CoV-2 virus last? And I saw the one initially we saw that it can last on plastic and steel for 72 hours. And then there was a study where the average found was that the anticipate was up to 9 days. Actually on the Princess, it was actually found up to 14 days. But this question relates then to the quarantining of the waste. If you keep then, let's say it's 9 days that the SARS-CoV-2 virus dies within, if you keep or isolate or quarantine that waste for 9 days, could you then dispose of it as non-healthcare waste because the virus would have died by that time?
The thing is, as you say, this is a new territory that we both not really sure. I wouldn't really say that when I've isolated the waste for 9 days, then the bacteria, the virus would be dead by that time. Unless maybe we do some tests, I don't know how to check if really the virus has died after the 9 days. But personally, I wouldn't take those chances that then we just dispose that waste as an ordinary waste. To me, it still remains a healthcare risk waste.
Okay. So there's a lot more questions, but I think we're going to leave it there. We want to respect people's time, and we wanted to approximately keep it to about 15 minutes. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to Niels.
Thank you,
Okay,
Garth, for fielding those questions. As we could see in the chat box, people are saying you haven't answered my question yet. It's impossible. Please make use of the opportunity that these regulations are out for comments, whether you do it through a professional body like SIOS or through other professional organizations like SIHO or whoever you belong to, or whether you as an individual wants to submit those comments. I know from my previous experience of serving on the ACOS, the Advisory Council, these comments have to be reviewed, and the technical committee that was appointed have to look at these. And if it's properly motivated and substantiated, then the technical committee have to take cognizance of it. So make use of the opportunity that these regulations are not just promulgated and say comply or else. In that regard, thank you very much once again, Jabu, for a presentation which, in my view, is difficult to present. I mean, law or legislation is not an easy thing to capture your attention all the time. But looking at the numbers in attendance, which was a full house today, over 500, which is the maximum that this webinar can take, and also a large number viewing us live on YouTube this morning. This is a very interesting topic, and thank you for your time, and thank you for the offer on behalf of, from the Department of Employment Labour for doing this presentation. We really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure once the regulations has gone through that process and it's been promulgated, and if any changes has been made to them, which I'm sure there will be, we can ask you again to join our SIOS members and maybe do the presentation on the final copy. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Just in closing then, thanks also to Garth for fielding those questions. Just a quick reminder that this webinar is verified by SIOS with 2 CPD points. Members can claim that. We've given you the information on how to claim it. And then also just a reminder that the webinar is recorded, so the recording as well as the presentations or the presentations will be made available to all SIOS members directly, but also on the SIOS website under latest news and on our Facebook page. And then there's also a quick reminder that we are actually hosting another webinar tomorrow, an excellent one called the topic Workplace Wellbeing Leadership. If you haven't registered for that one yet, please do so. That is about an hour webinar presentation, and a very exciting speaker, which is Professor Andrew Sharman from the UK, the IOS president there. And then also keep an eye out for our webinar and register for the ventilation and as a key COVID-19 barrier on the 7th of September. That then concludes today's webinar. Thank you very much for everyone's attendance. Thank you for Gareth in the back end, making sure the technical issues are working. Thanks to our presenter again, and to Garth and all our members for joining us this morning. Please have a safe day further. Thank you.